Now, just as I thought Rolly Romero couldn't get any more deluded than he was, he's come out and said that he's a big 135 pounder and he wants to fight Errol Spence Jr. I mean, how incredible is that from Rolly Romero? This was the guy who was saying that Gervonta Tank Davis wasn't a dangerous fighter, as if Tank Davis didn't knock out like 95% of the guys he's fought. And now he's saying he wants to fight Errol Spence at 145, at 147 pounds, who is way bigger than Gervonta Tank Davis, who is probably on the top two pound for pound. It's probably between him and Crawford. And Spence is a very big welterweight. Danny Garcia described Errol Spence as pretty much a middleweight. That's how much weight Errol Spence cuts. He has not moved up in weight since he debuted as a professional. When he first debuted, I think he was 149 pounds. And he's in his early 30s and he's fighting at 147 pounds. So the size of Errol Spence compared to Rolly Romero. I know Romero looked pretty big in the Gervonta Tank Davis fight, but he is nowhere near big enough to compete with Errol Spence Jr. Now, I think this all stems from Errol Spence saying that Rolly Romero should fight Frank Martin, who I think Errol Spence actually has turned quite a bit of a promoter recently. He's been promoting this fighter called Frank Martin, who is a 135 pounder, which is a much more realistic fight for Rolly Romero. And obviously, Rolly Romero probably wasn't feeling that and thought to himself, screw this Spence guy and screw this Martin guy. I'm going to fight Errol Spence Jr. He was very cagey in his fight against Gervonta Tank Davis. I'm talking about obviously Rolly Romero. And while he was able to keep Tank Davis in the first couple of rounds at distance, he's not going to have a hope in hell against Errol Spence trying to do that. Spence is way longer. Spence probably has the best jab in the whole of boxing. It's probably between him and Devin Haney. And Spence is relentless. This guy punches from all sorts of angles. And his conditioning is amazing. Once he gets going, I mean, the guy doesn't stop. He is a high volume puncher. He's not a one punch knockout artist. There are guys in his weight class that definitely hit harder than him, in my opinion. But Errol Spence, in terms of volume of punches, punch selection, his ability to go downstairs, to go upstairs, he is fantastic. And I just see him completely overwhelming Rolly Romero. I mean, Rolly would have no chance. He was trying to use a lot of dirty tactics in the Gervonta Tank Davis fight, Rolly Romero, and he was not successful. Tank Davis was composed, which is one of the really good things about Tank Davis, by the way. I believe he has a lot of mental strength, which is more of an intangible because Rolly Romero was very, very dirty in that fight, but Tank Davis wasn't phased and he kept coming at Romero. Yeah, that stuff that he tried to do on Tank Davis is not going to work against Errol Spence. Errol Spence is bigger than him and will be pushing him back all night, if they were to fight hypothetically. But obviously that fight's not going to happen. Errol Spence is focused on Terence Crawford and Terence Crawford only. And if he is not able to get the Crawford fight, I suspect that he'd move up to 154 pounds. Though I am hopeful and I do think the Errol Spence-Terence Crawford fight will happen. But yeah, what did you guys think of Rolly Romero essentially calling out Errol Spence Jr.? The guy, he is deluded, you'd have to say at this point. I mean, if you didn't think that in the build-up, in the press conferences for the Gervonta Tank Davis fight, surely you'd believe that now. I mean, is this guy being serious? He wants to jump out, like 3 weight classes to fight Errol Spence Jr.? When he couldn't beat a 5'5" Gervonta Tank Davis? Rolly Romero is just not skilled enough to compete with Errol Spence at all. We seen what Spence did to Ugas, and that wasn't from one big punch. That was a sustained beating, and it would be the same if he were to fight Rolly Romero. Ugas is obviously much bigger than Rolly Romero, and he's way fundamentally better than Rolly Romero. And although boxing is not because fighter A beats fighter B and fighter B beats fighter C means fighter A beats fighter C, it doesn't necessarily work like that. But I feel like in this case, The eye test is very telling, and I'm pretty sure 99.99% of boxing fans would predict a Errol Spence victory if those two were ever to step in the ring. At least while Spence is got his faculties together. I mean, you never know what could happen. If that was another fighter who was involved in the Errol Spence car accident, they probably would have never recovered psychologically and neurologically, and they probably would have been washed. But obviously, that's not the same as Errol Spence. He is very mentally strong, very resilient, so credit to him. He was able to come back from a horrific car crash and beat the brakes off Danny Garcia. He really beat Danny Garcia so easily in that fight, Errol Spence. Danny Garcia really couldn't get much off. And that wasn't Errol Spence anywhere near his best. But the Spence against Yordanis Ugas, that was probably the best we've ever seen Spence. I mean, some people might say the Sean Porter fight was very good in the Kell Brook fight, but I feel like in the Kell Brook fight and the Sean Porter fight, he got hit a lot more in comparison to the Ugas fight. I mean, he really didn't take much punishment at all, other than the time where his mouth guard fell out and he was on the ropes. That was more so due to lack of concentration than poor defense. That was the only time he really got, I guess you could say, stunned. Whereas in the Porter fight and the Kell Brook fight, there were a lot of exchanges. The early rounds against Kell Brook, some people or a lot of people had Kell Brook up, and the Sean Porter fight was extremely competitive up until the knockdown. That really gave it the edge for Errol Spence in terms of the decision. He was able to get away with it for his knockdown in, I think it was the 11th round or 10th round in that fight. So yeah, absolutely incredible for Rolley Romero to come out and say he wants, to fight Errol Spence. So let me know what you lot in the comment section below think. What next for Rolley Romero? Who would you like to see him fight? Is Rolley Romero really that good of a fighter? I mean, to be fair, in one of my last videos, I did mention him as a good fighter on Tank Davis's resume, but that's as far as it goes. He is an awkward fighter and he's pretty good, yeah, but he is not elite. And that's just genuinely what I think based off what we've seen from him, but I do think he is good. Though he may lack fundamentals at times, sometimes being awkward actually gives you an advantage. I mean, Deontay Wilder at times looks like he lacks some fundamentals, but because he's so athletically gifted and he's so awkward, it makes it difficult for the fighters he's fighting because they're not used to seeing someone work in that way, operate in that way. They're used to seeing someone who was a lot more robotic and who was a lot more conventional, and it's like, oh, I've seen this hundreds of times. Whereas when you've got an awkward fighter like a Romero or Deontay Wilder, it's like very, very off-putting. It's like, well, how do I actually approach this guy? Should I just use my fundamentals, move around and box him? Or should I just be aggressive and knock him out because he lacks footwork and so on and so forth? But, yeah, Romero definitely not as successful as Wilder was at heavyweight. But, yeah, I'm going to end the video here, guys. So, peace.